Welcome once again, and an especially warm welcome to our international audience. My name is Charlene Diaz, and I'm the head of programs for Filipinas Heritage Library. I'll also be your host for today's event. This lecture is presented by Filipinas Heritage Library, or FHL, managed for the public by Ayala Foundation. Our mission is to stoke interest in the story of the Filipino through our collections of books, periodicals, documents, photographs, music, videos, and digital resources. If you haven't visited FHL since its renovation, come spend time in its refreshed interiors. Our open spaces, letting in natural light, is a cool and quiet refuge from the city bustle. The library welcomes visits on site to meet your research and study needs. We also offer reproduction services and virtual consultations. Check our website for more details. Today's webinar is the second of the Roderick Hall Memorial Lectures honoring the legacy of Mr. Roderick Hall, a staunch advocate of war memory and an ardent supporter and beloved patron of the library. Beginning with 700 items, the Roderick Hall collection now encompasses over 5,000 pieces of World War II related books, manuscripts, and audiovisual files. Through lectures such as this one and other programs activating the Roderick Hall collection, the memory of World War II remains alive. This lecture series aims to reach Filipinos here in the homeland and all over the world, encouraging them to draw insights from our history. The Philippine nation, as we know it, emerged from the Second World War, reborn due to Filipino resilience and innovation. Now, let me introduce our speaker. Genevieve Clutario is the Andrew W. Mellon Assistant Professor of American Studies at Wellesley College. She is the author of Beauty Regimes, A History of Power and Modern Empire in the Philippines, 1898 to 1941. She is the recipient of the Duke University Press Scholars of Color First Book Award and the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University First Book Award. Before arriving at Wellesley, Clutario was an assistant professor in history and literature at Harvard University. She continues to pursue research and teaching interests focusing on Asian American narratives and global perspectives, Filipino studies, comparative histories of culture and modern empire, transnational feminisms, and of course, gender, race, and the politics of fashion and beauty. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Genevieve Clutario.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that warm introduction. Thank you to the FHL for the invitation to share with you some snippets from my new book entitled Beauty Regimes. So my book overall uses beauty as a framework to examine how modern empire functions and how people navigate and negotiate living under an imperial regime. So the book starts from perhaps more intuitive arenas, such as personal wardrobes, and then moves to beauty pageant industry, to Philippine lingerie, to the beauty labor practiced in colonial industrial schools and Bilibid prison, to the making of a high fashion industry. And it ends with World War II on the horizon. There's so much I want to share with you today, but to dedicate more time to having critical engagement with all of you, I'm just going to present short snippets from the chapter of my book that focuses on the Manila Carnival Queen contest. Beauty pageantry developed into an industry through the work of the colonial state, the Philippine press, contest participants, and their supporters. Together, they created a machine that produced Filipina beauty queens. The beauty pageant industrial complex forged a deep relationship between pageants and politics, highlighting the long-lasting legacy of Filipina beauty queens. Contests showcasing an ideal of femininity in the Philippines defined and defended national identity along shifting lines of gender, class, ethnicity, race, and citizenship in a colonial context. Philippine nation building and American imperial expansion were in constant contact, conflict, and negotiation with one another. The Manila Carnival Queen's prominence in public discourse demonstrates how defining the nation through Filipina femininity was inherently a gendered process that required many forms of labor and work. Beauty pageants were not just tangential features of large-scale exhibitions, they evolved into major events in their own right. And as they did, the title of the Beauty Queen became the ultimate status marker. Print media catapulted Filipino beauty contest winners into celebrity status with a public fascination and recognition of their achievement on and off the pageant stage. The celebrity that beauty queens garnered in turn compelled the institutionalization of beauty pageants in the Philippines. The growth of print media, and in particular, the development of pictorial magazines and newspapers, facilitated the fascination in beauty queens on and off the stage. The Manila Carnival Queens were subjects of featured stories that exhibited their portraits in addition to detailed descriptions of their personal backgrounds, what types of gowns they wore, and how they carried themselves during the carnival festivities. Starting with the first Manila Carnival, news sources published considerable reportage of the contestants' appearance, background, and personal lives to be consumed by the public. This practice would remain consistent with beauty queens and beauty pageants, often making headlines or entire features would be dedicated to contestants' biographies and social appearances. The fascination in beauty queens and their lives outside the competition crystallized their celebrity status. For example, after the 1938 Miss Philippines competition, Graphic published a multi-page article entitled Beauty's 1938 Models, detailing the backgrounds and lives of pageant winners. It focused on the themes of their wealth, prestige, and glamour. For example, it reported that the winner of the title, Miss Luzon, who was the first runner-up to Miss Philippines, Rosario Ferro, went to school at St. Scholastica College. She traveled around the world with Pesita de los Reyes a couple of years ago. And Pesita de los Reyes was the winner of the Miss Philippines 1929 contest and became a prominent lawyer. A 1927 souvenir photo from the Miss Philippines pageant reads, "Beauty is a divine attribute, the incarnation of all that is good, of all that is pleasing to the heart and the sense, to whom you and I, dear admirer, bow our heads in sincere homage." This quote-unquote homage came in a number of public forms within the spectacle of the beauty pageant and in the press. Popular newspapers and magazines published opinion pieces, poems, and tributes, all celebrating the beauty of contestants and crowned winners. The embellished language of these homages reveals the heightened level of enthusiasm generated among beauty queens' admirers. One admirer from Paco, Manila, felt compelled to write a tribute to beauty, to a beauty queen representing an entirely different island province, Miss Cebu, whom they felt was worthy of a throne or any kingdom for that matter. By the 19-teens, developing photography and print technologies made portraits and photographs much more accessible in the Philippines. Portraits of beauty queens could be purchased as collectibles or circulated as postcards. In this way, beauty could be consumed and faces and names could become familiar, expanding the beauty queen's public. The mother of Miss Philippines 1930, Consuelo Monina Acuña, recalls that pictures of her daughter came in hundreds daily, with most carefully worded notes begging for the queen's signature, and clippings from foreign papers bearing Monina's picture poured into my hands. Enriqueta David, society correspondent for Graphic, described accurately what Carnival Queens had become by the 1930s. As Carnival Queen, she has become a celebrity. Carnival Queens are perhaps the first of female celebrities in the Philippines. She has a public, a large amount of people who admire her, who can look at her because of the pictures, and who are her fans. This has been made possible not only by the event of the Manila Carnival, but through the mass production of images via photographs. The culture of celebrity dovetailed with colonial period nationalist politics. Filipina beauty queens' fame also served as an apt vehicle for Philippine nationalism. Beauty pageants were the first major platform outside of warfare to rally a large number of people under the banner of Filipino. The emergence of beauty pageants also coincided with a new phase of Filipino nationalism under the US colonial regime. And indeed, the figure of the beauty queen came to play a key role in embodying and actualizing nationalist sentiments and identities. The lure of beauty queens became a rallying force. The beauty pageant and the beauty queen function outside of formal nation building, and yet contestants, winners, and the spectacle of the pageant themselves each had the power to incite powerful emotions and investment from the public. The Filipino Carnival Queen contest and its winners exhibited the ideal characteristics of an emerging and imagined Filipino national community. The idea that a public Filipina figure whose fame was sourced from beauty could represent a Filipino nation took root during the first Manila Carnival. One Iloilo-based newspaper praised Pura Villanueva Calao, and I just want to note that that name might sound very familiar to you. And so I'm using her married name or all of her names just so that you know her as both Pura Villanueva and Pura Villanueva Calao. So just as a side note. So this newspaper praised her, declaring, if she can occupy the throne of a carnival, she can also that of a nation. The article directly tied the title of Manila Carnival Queen to a Filipino nation that had yet to be realized. And although Villanueva Calao in 1938 described the first Manila Carnival as an event organized by and for Americans, Filipinos used the Manila Carnival Queen contest to create counter-hegemonic discourses of modern womanhood and also express and perform a unified and modern national identity, challenging criticisms that the Philippines was unfit to be an independent modern nation. We can briefly look to 1908, the first Manila Carnival Queen contest, as an example of such. The first Manila Carnival Association comprised of American businessmen and colonial officials. Through this large-scale spectacle, carnival organizers sought to display the success and potential of the Philippines and draw attention to the natural resources and industry of the Philippines, enticing both local and foreign investors. Second, the revelry of a carnival would draw attention away from the violence of the Philippine-American War, which began in 1899 and lasted almost a decade. Discrepancies and tensions that emerged during the first Carnival Queen competition belied deliberate marketing of it as a democratic and friendly process. The competition, which touted fairness and friendship, was in fact rife with scandal and unethical behavior. Winners of the competition were determined by the number of votes one earned, and ballots could be purchased in designated news publications. As the contest progressed, the disparities between Filipina, American, and Spanish contestants were increasingly alarming to the Filipino community. The disparities in the ballot counts were so great that the integrity and fairness of the campaign and voting processes were called into question. Members of the press were involved in the vote counting, discovered ballot irregularities, including certain American publications that printed 4 ballots rather than the one permitted. As a result, carnival officials suspended popular voting and left the selection of the Manila Carnival Queen to members of the executive committee. The executive committee not only suspended voting, but also changed the number of titles to be awarded in the contest. So in addition to the position of Manila Carnival Queen, the committee also created 2 auxiliary titles, Queen of the Orient, who would be Filipino, and Queen of the Occident, who would be white, American, or Spanish. Carnival organizers regarded the creation of these titles as a way to satisfy the racially divided constituents. Eventually, Pura Villanueva Calao, a young woman from Iloilo, was crowned Queen of the Orient, while Marjorie Colton became Queen of the Occident. Carnival organizers hoped crowning both a Filipina and an American would represent an image of harmony rather than animosity. The rhetoric of fairness and acceptance could not quite disguise the racist underpinnings of the Manila Carnival Queen contest, though. Although carnival officials changed the contest to assuage tensions and appear fair, the creation of 2 separate titles for a Filipina and an American woman used racialized segregationist logic, negating the message of equality, unity, and friendship between Filipinos and Americans. In many ways, Pura Villanueva Calao's 1908 title was runner-up, Although the Queen of the Orient was the winner among the Filipino contestants, the title Manila Carnival Queen was bestowed upon the American Queen of the Occident. The queens also received dramatically different treatment. In contrast to the arrangements made for Colton, carnival organizers arranged no transportation to the King and Queen of the Orient from the parade, marking the first day of the festivities to the coronation at the grandstand, leaving them scrambling to find their own transportation. When the couple tried to pass through the entrance gates, the guard demanded that they pay 20 pesetas and refused them entrance, stating, "Whether royalty or Christ himself, you cannot pass through these gates without a penny." In direct contrast to the carefully coordinated performances of Filipino ceding power to the Americans during the coronation ceremony, the Filipino press presented these anecdotes as evidence of racial tension and power struggles. El Renacimiento claimed that the carnival revealed the antagonistic race to claim supremacy in the East. The reality of the racist foundations of imperialism could not be contained by choreographed public displays of revelry. Critiquing the first Manila Carnival Queen contest provided a way for Filipino nationalist press to air its grievances with the colonial states. Despite such careful orchestration, the Filipina Beauty Queen and Filipino spectators challenged representations of American white supremacy, in part by praising the Filipina Beauty Queen's style. When news article describing the pageantry of the parades and the appearance of the carnival royalty at the grandstand used descriptions of dress to illuminate the apparent disparities between the queens and kings of the Occident and the Orient. One article contended that the monarchs of the Occident made a sorry impression, appearing very simple in their attire and were very ordinary looking, echoing the insults and criticisms elite Visayan women. So in my book, I also talk about Visayan women who insult American women in first encounters. I talk about it right off the bat in chapter 1. So in this article that was talking about the dress and comparing the dress of these two queens, they went on to say that not so, however, those of the Orient. Villanueva Cala was luxuriously costumed, beautiful and resplendent in her dignity, affectionate towards all. The development of the Manila Carnival Queen contest itself reflects the intertwined process of maintaining beauty pageantry and constructing a version of nationalism through a Filipina identity. Although Manila is just one location in a region made up of thousands of islands, the intent of the Manila Carnival was to present the archipelago as a cohesive whole. It provided visual and performative articulations of a Filipino national identity even before such a nation existed. In 1926, an invitation to participate in the international pageant of Pulchritude, which would eventually become Miss Universe, and this contest was taking place in Galveston, Texas. This invitation facilitated the creation of a Miss Philippines title. Although the Philippines did not participate in this Miss Universe contest, Manila Carnival organizers instituted two major titles that year, a Manila Carnival Queen and a Miss Philippines. So the following year, the Miss Philippines pageant replaced the Manila Carnival Queen contest completely. From 1926 until the onset of World War II, which halted the competition, the top pageant title was Miss Philippines. The national pageant formed prior to the 1934 Tidings-McDuffie Act, also known as the Philippines Independence Act, which officially declared the Philippines would be an independent nation after a 10-year transition period. And the title Miss Philippines predated that of the President of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. But performances of nationalism through beauty pageantry were not necessarily inspired by patriotic duty, but rather by the power of celebrity embodied in the beauty queen. The Manila Carnival Queen incited, circulated, and encouraged this patriotism vis-a-vis the celebration of Filipina beauty. But the Miss Philippines title made an overt declaration of a country and nation. The pageant industry directly engaged with the complexity of colonial nationalism. The 1926 Manila Carnival promotional poster for Philippine Beauties, for example, printed all 37 contestants' portraits scattered across a map of the Philippines. The map was superimposed on the US and Philippine flags, placed side by side, with a portrait of Miss Philippines, Anita Noble, placed within the Philippine flag's sun. The two flags reminded onlookers that spectacles of patriotism and Filipino nationalism still required a semblance of allegiance to the United States. By the 1927 Miss Philippines contest, however, the visual symbols had changed. Promotional materials began to showcase only Miss Philippines and the Philippine flag. While Miss Philippines had no official political role, she was the figurehead of the Philippine nation. I want to end here, and I hope that this kind of gives you some insight into the ways that I think about pageant politics and the Manila Carnival Queen contest and the power of beauty queens.
Start my video. Thank you, Genevieve. That was incredibly insightful. I don't think many of us realized how much beauty pageants were related to the formation of the nation, or the idea that the Miss Philippines or the Carnival Queen title is older than that of the presidency is a bit mind-boggling, right? So we're going to move now to the Q&A, and I'm sure our audience is eager to continue this discussion with you. Let's officially open the floor for questions. But before we start, here are another couple set of reminders. For Zoom attendees, please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. We give priority to that box over questions typed in the chat box. And for Facebook viewers, please use the comment section of the Facebook live stream. We'll do our best to get to all your questions. So we actually received quite a number of pre-registration questions from our Zoom registrants. So I'm going to start there and then move into the Zoom chat box. So this first question is quite scholarly in its interest, but
Sure.
This person would like to know, M. Hendrickson, is there a website with a list of women who participated in the beauty contests of the era? They are searching for their Lola.
Oh, okay, that's great. Yes, actually there is. It's a really fantastic website. If you just Google Manila Carnival Queens blogspot, it's a personal website created by someone who actually wrote a book about celebrities, women celebrities in Pampanga, and I think it's held at FHL. But if you look at his website, I think his name is Alex Castro, and he just did this as a hobby, and he actually created, you can look, there's a search, sort of like a search tab bar, and you could search by year, you can search by region. It's just an incredible resource, and I'm so happy that it exists. It was really, sometimes I still Google it and I just read it because I love it.
Yes, it's those who are really passionate about the work that put their, spare time, heart and soul into it. The second pre-registration question is actually interested in you. And this Jenna asks, what inspired Miss Genevieve Clutario to tackle beauty pageants and cultural history in her work?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you. I think I knew very early on in graduate school that I wanted to do some kind of Filipino history, and I wanted to do a history of gender and women, and I wanted to know more about imperialism, and but I was a little frustrated with the kind of, not frustrated, but I just wanted to know more about the sort of how imperialism connects with everyday life, and how people live under imperialism. And so when I was doing my research, I found all of these photographs and newspaper articles that talked a lot about Filipino women's appearances. And I think that, having grown up watching a lot of Miss Universe with my mom, I think it was already sort of there for me to be like interested in the concept of beauty. And that kind of gave me a lens to look at, to just be very sensitive to those kinds of documents in, archives and libraries. And actually, somebody had told me I wasn't going to find very much about, to do women's history the way that I wanted to do. And my advisor just said, no, 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 I think you have something there. You should go for it. And I did. So yeah, I think it sort of as a constellation of things that kind of came together to get me interested. Thank you for that question.
We're so glad that your advisor encouraged you to pursue this topic, because it's turned out to be so rich. I feel like you were prescient in your interest. So our next question is from Amelito. I hope I said that correctly. They say, I'm curious to know, who gets the opportunity to join a given year's pageant? Can anyone join the pageant? Or, as I imagine, women from privileged backgrounds would have the advantage or be a priority?
That's such a great observation. It's really astute. So overall, every year the pageant rules change and evolve, and there is little consistency in terms of the rules. So, at first it was supposed to be voting by ballots that you purchase. And later, and as we know, there was drama that happened. And so winners were selected. And then later on, it's, there are judges. But I think voting becomes, different forms of voting is sort of what happens. But in order to be selected as contestants, you're absolutely right. It's women from more elite backgrounds who are chosen. And so, as much as I talk about, I am a huge admirer of beauty pageants, but I think you're bringing up a really important point, which is that it's also important to be very critical of them because they are quite exclusive. And they're really different from, the way that we talk about beauty pageants today. Oftentimes we talk about them as Cinderella stories. And that's not the case prior to World War II. These women are already from very privileged backgrounds. They come from very well-known families. And then the queen status kind of catapults them even further. And, actually helps facilitate the unification of certain families. And then later on I think in the later 1920s, universities start to sponsor and select women, select co-eds to represent their university or their clubs. And then that becomes a way to facilitate them into larger beauty pageants. So it's all these different scenes of privilege and class status that you absolutely identified.
I'm so thrilled with the question too, because we're bringing in these issues of race and maybe even upward mobility. If you're from a certain
Totally.
school, you can rise through the pageants. This will lead us into what you talk about or what you call the beauty industrial complex, because that's one of the factors. Related to that question, here is another great one. This one is from Margot. She asks, aside from Pura Villanueva Calao and her daughter Maria, are there any other carnival queens who made an impact in society, whether in politics or culture, etc.?
Yeah, so I talked about De Los Reyes, for example. She's a really famous writer and lawyer. So she makes a huge impact in terms of, she's one of the first prominent lawyers that are women in the Philippines. So she has a huge political impact and has a lot of clout. And in fact, there's a book that is Who's Who of the Philippines, and it's published in the 1930s, and almost all of them are former beauty queens. And so it's almost like a checkbox. Were you in a beauty pageant? Are you important? You were in a beauty pageant. There's a correlation there. So that's one person who comes to mind. And there's sort of, I just want to mention one other person who, she doesn't win Manila Carnival Queen, but she is a runner-up, and it's Katie Delacruz, who is a really famous singer at the time. She was a really famous jazz singer. And so I think that's another person who I just want to highlight. Yeah.
Hey, that's really fascinating. And dare I say it, but perhaps the most famous, relatively contemporary beauty queen would be our former first lady.
Oh, totally. Oh, yeah. So I was only thinking like Manila Carnival Queen content.
I understand.
Yeah. But when we move on, like there's a lot of famous Miss Worlds. You know, I think when we move post-war period, you can really see the correlation.
Really see it.
You know, prominent women.
So we have a question from Monica, and she's asking specifically about the contest, the first Carnival Queen contest that you described. She says, "Hi, Genevieve. Thank you for the talk. I am curious about the cheating. Who did the cheating or discrepancies in the votes? Who did the discrepancies in the votes favor?"
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that question. I love this story so much. So the cheating is mostly on the American side, and how they cheated. Oh, so there's a number of ways that cheating happened. So, but the big way is something that I mentioned briefly, which is, and I'll elaborate more, is you're supposed to be able to vote by purchasing a newspaper, and it has to be a sort of valid newspaper. And then each newspaper has one ballot. And so this is because the Manila Carnival Queen contest was actually a fundraiser that was supposed to fund the entire Manila Carnival. And so so that's why you have to purchase ballots. So you're only supposed to have one ballot per newspaper. But one of the American newspapers or a couple of American newspapers printed 4 instead of the 1. So you would get, multiple votes, right? And presumably if you bought an American newspaper, you would most likely be voting for the American contestant, right? And then the other way that this cheating also happened was that fake newspapers were created with fake ballots. And so when they started counting ballots, and they every so often they would print in newspapers the ballot counts, that the numbers of ballots, the discrepancies were so huge that they didn't make sense. And they also the math didn't make sense in terms of number of newspapers to like number of ballots. So there was like obvious cheating, and then there were rumors of people in the Manila Carnival Queen contest committee also just doing some shady stuff, and because of those rumors, that's how they halted the voting, and then new people were chosen to select the queens. And a lot of women, so Marjorie Colton is actually not the original American winner. A lot of women bowed out because of the scandal. And then they were sort of like scrambling for people to declare as winners. Yeah.
With that background story that you just told us, the fact that they still had the gall to crown the queen of the Occident as right?
As the queen of the whole thing. Yeah.
Wow. I mean,
yeah, even after all of that scandal, and it's because it's part of this whole big, it's the politics of the Manila Carnival, right? It's it was a way to showcase American empire in the Philippines. And so they wanted it to be a part, the pageantry was a huge part of the politics. And so as much as it wanted to seem very friendly, it was also about saying we're friendly, but the United States is still the empire. And if you look at these sort of documents, they have these brochures that they handed out, and it says like people making the Philippines, and it's all like the white men, the white American men who are in this carnival committee. So there's they couldn't deviate from that script of colonialism despite that drama, right? What is empire if not drama?
I'm so glad you brought up politics and empire so specifically. Monica, who asked a question earlier, has a follow-up. And the question is, how does this reflect the politics involved in the pageant process? So you've already begun to answer that, but if you want to develop it more,
Sure.
yeah, it's how those factors work together.
Yeah. So I talked about it a little bit, and I can just give some more clarification and some more context. So the Manila Carnival is also referred to as the Philippine Exposition. And like other expositions, at the turn of the century, these are huge showcases on a global level. So it's kind of like the St. Louis World's Fair, the Madrid Exposition, the Paris Exposition, so on and so forth. So when you have an exposition, it's to showcase to the world that we are here, we've made it, but also to get investors to invest in whatever kind of modernization projects you have somewhere. So the Philippine Exposition showcased, it showcased technology in the Philippines. It showcased like different natural resources. It showcased other kinds of like commodities and products like copra, like things made from for rope, like just on any kind of like commercial industry. But the whole point is to say it's not just about the Philippines. It's that the United States puts the Philippines into this sort of like modern capitalist context. So that was actually the main point in the Manila Carnival. And then the Manila Carnival Queen contest was supposed to be the fundraiser to like keep this, to put on a huge production. But what ends up happening is that the Manila Carnival Queen contest eclipses the exposition itself, and it becomes the center point, where there was one year it wasn't held and they had to bring it back. And so I think, it's important to understand those connections between economy, politics, both in the local perspective, but also the global perspective, and to remember the sort of origins of the Manila Carnival Queen contest. And the sort of unintended consequence was that this pageant becomes a platform for nationalism, and that was not the intent of the contest.
Yeah, when you think about the incredible racism on display in the Manila Exposition, it's incredible this subversion happened. We have another question from the Zoom Q&A box from Mitzi that develops this idea. She writes, I must have missed this from your lecture, but regarding discrimination of Filipinos in beauty pageants during the colonial period, how did the Filipinos retaliate or protest to stand against this racism in their own context?
Oh, thank you for that question. Yeah, no, that's great. So how they did this is through a number of ways. So one way is through the Philippine press. So and a lot of this press was written in Spanish, and then also in local press that used both Spanish and whatever vernacular language in that particular region. So and then these newspapers would then use the beauty pageant as a way to critique the United States. So they would say, so some articles would be like, how dare the United States treat the Filipina beauty queen in such a disrespectful way. And then they would then use that as a way to have a tangent to be like, this tells us about the unfairness of US imperialism in the Philippines. And so they would retaliate in that way. They would also retaliate by in the book I refer it to as petty politics. In an earlier chapter, they would use pettiness as a way to make digs at American inferiority, which is to say, like, well, the American queens are not even that impressive. The Filipino ones are just so much more impressive. And then they would describe in detail the kinds of jewels that they were wearing, or like the dresses. And so it's these sort of it was a time period where to critique colonialism outright was illegal. It was sedition. So you use beauty pageants, which seems frivolous or innocuous, to actually make an argument, an anti-colonial argument. But at the same time, I think you're right, or I think somebody, if you mentioned or somebody earlier said it, that they're also doing it in a way that also recreates a lot of hierarchies, both like racial and class, by praising the sort of facial features of certain beauty queens, or praising, their jewelry, lots of diamonds and pearls and stuff. And that is also based on sort of previous hierarchies that were developed during the Spanish colonial period. So I think it's important to look at the critiques of American empire, and then look at, some of the problems in that sort of in a little bit in those discourses. Yeah.
Yes. It's an incredibly complex situation. And I think what you did just then was very succinctly describe the carnivalesque and how it functions within this system. And I hope we'll be able to get back to that later. But I have a fascinating question here from Krisha, who says, because we've been talking a lot about the prestige behind the women who become queens, were there any contestants who were part of indigenous groups?
Yeah. Okay. So yes and no. So sometimes there are. And so if you recall in some of the photographs where they have the map of the Philippines, there are the contest develops where it's supposed to showcase different regions of the Philippines. And then this is where you have this idea that you have a queen from a different region all sort of competing to then become Miss Philippines or the Manila Carnival Queen. So the Manila Carnival Queen kind of stands in as like the nation. And so in some cases, you do have women from indigenous groups as representing a particular, location or region. But sometimes, and I need to, it was unclear to me, but my suspicion is that sometimes they weren't actually native to that region, but are representing that region. And so it's a little bit tricky to like verify, but that was sort of my suspicion. And then there's also in some contests where they have women sort of wear things that are supposed to represent a particular indigenous group, and it's wrong. So it is not quite there. And so I think that, your question brings up a lot of like complicated tensions in terms of like what constitutes particular identities, and then how that's used to showcase or to articulate what constitutes Filipino and the Philippines. So it's a really important question.
Yes, in fact, your answer was fascinating to me too, because a term like cultural appropriation seems fairly recent, right? But what you just described there already seems like a form of that, of appropriating certain dress and aspects in order to pass and pretend to be. So
Yeah.
We have a few interesting questions here about the nitty-gritty of the carnivals. So an anonymous attendee asks, what did the pageant winners get, especially the Filipinas?
Okay, yeah, so it changes from year to year. Sometimes they get money, and there's usually a cash prize, and that prize grows larger and larger. And then this also facilitates the proliferation of beauty pageants, not just Manila Carnival Queen contests, so you could win a lot of money. But later on, you would also get celebrities. So this is part of my argument where sometimes you would get advertisement deals later on, or sometimes the prize is not immediate. It kind of happens like a little bit later, where you get fame, and a lot of the times this is not what I think, but this is what the discourse was, which is they would win by getting married. So they would have these huge so you would see like, oh, winner of 1928 marries somebody very, very prestigious and stuff. And so the idea was that you would get a cash prize, but you would also be catapulted into this idea of desirability. And then that the sort of reward is you get married to someone who's also very elite.
And would that elite marriage, would that strengthen familiar connections, or was that actually a form of upward mobility?
I think both. I think
it was
both.
both.
Yeah. And
everything
it depends. Yeah, because this is also the time of a growing middle class, right?
Yes,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
The paradoxes you're presenting, like continually presenting, are so interesting. But continuing this theme of identity and celebrity, I'm so sorry, I don't think I can pronounce this name. But this viewer from Zoom asks, how has the role of the Carnival Queen or Miss Philippines evolved? Today's beauty queens seem to have the same function. That is, figureheads can highlight Filipino identity and inspire Filipinos to come together as a nation. But of course, that's also problematic. So how would you tackle that question?
Oh, that's a good one. And let me see if I can talk through it. Because as a historian, like I stick to my time period. But no, that's a really good question. So I think in many ways, as a historian, what I'm concerned with is change over time, but I also think it's important to look at what stays the same. And I think what you've pointed out is that a lot of the things stay the same precisely because what these pageants are doing are also reifying, or not just reifying, but constructing particular norms, right? So this is how ideas of beauty get crystallized or cemented, and also norms of what it means to be a woman, or an ideal woman, right? So there are many definitions of womanhood and femininity, but this is this kind of idea of a normative version of it. And so when we say things are normative, those are ideological things that are really powerful, and you can see how powerful they are because things stay the same in many ways. But what sort of changes, I think, in sort of more modern beauty pageants, so by the time you get Miss World, Miss Universe, for example, is that they're not just pulling from elite women to say that they're going to represent the nation. They're pulling from so it's not just like from elite families, but what what they are pulling though is from this idea of what looks like a beauty queen. So that's sort of a different thing, right? Because you know if you look at the photographs of the Manila Carnival Queens, yes, many of them look very similar, but there's also not a lot, but there's some variation, right? And I think as you have more of an industrial complex of training beauty queens, like it's really hard to be a beauty queen. Like you really have to train, and there are things that they sort of look for because of what it is expected to win. I think that kind of shifts things. And also, but I also want to say that there are also these sort of other ways that beauty pageants have sort of sprouted into other directions that is not about the nation, but is about particular communities and identities, right? So, beauty pageants are so ubiquitous in the Philippines, but it's because it's like a really powerful vehicle to claim community and identity that could be very subversive against the norms, right? So you have a lot of, trans beauty pageants, right? And that has been happening for a long time. Like that is, it's so important, has a really long history, and it's really powerful. And then you also have it in terms of the diaspora, where you have like Filipino, OFWs having beauty pageants in Hong Kong on Sundays. Like my favorite documentary is Sunday Beauty Queen. And so I think that it's also important to see shifts in who claims beauty pageants and who uses beauty pageants that go beyond this idea of representing to the nation, that I find really interesting.
Gosh, I'm I'm also trying to process what you just said. So we started with beauty pageants as nation building, and now beauty pageants is forming communities. It's a lot. But since you mentioned this, we actually have a means of claiming identity. We have a question that asks, is transgender already accepted at beauty pageants? Or even for me, I'm curious to extend that question. Historically, what has the transgender, like what role have they played in the evolution, if your research has encountered any of that?
Yeah, so I only have like a really short snippet in my book because of like sources that I found. So, I'm like sort of tied to whatever evidence I can find. But I think when we think about trans communities and trans identities, this story that I have in the chapter is that there's an article that pops up. It's so short, and there's a photograph and of a beauty queen, and the title says queen in quotes, queen or queen, like who's queen? I forget the exact title, but it was queen in quotes. And so the name of the queen, her name is Angeline. And then they sort of use language that we would find super offensive now, so I'm not going to reiterate, but sort of trying to kind of just give you a picture is like questioning sort of that person's gender identity, right, or that person's gender, and trying to do it in a playful way. But this article is super offensive. But what I took from it was to say that here's this person, I think this happens in the 1920s, maybe early 1930s, and she claims the title queen and makes it something of her own. And I think that is such an important history, because if you look at the sort of proliferation of beauty pageants and also the proliferation of displays of beauty in public, that happens a lot in trans communities, right? And also, in kabaklaan, right? And like they do a lot of artistry and a lot of labor and work that actually feeds into the beauty pageant complex. So the beauty pageant industry is also like informed by and often trained by people in these various like queer communities, so I think that needs to sort of be accounted for, where when you trace, and I think the way that I try to do it is like you trace labor. Where does work happen? So if you think of beauty as work, you look at who is doing the work, and then you'll be able to look at this kind of long history that it'll show up.
That's an incredible answer. And it's also a really fascinating way to document, like if you really want to find out how to do it. Just wow, this Q&A is making me so happy. We have a question from Facebook. I believe this is also Marla Hendrickson, who asked a question earlier, a pre-reg question. Her new question is, can you please tell us more about the clothing worn by the contestants? What were the rules and expectations? Was fabric and fashion cost prohibitive for some women who could not afford the lavish wardrobe?
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely. It was absolutely class prohibitive. So in the first one, I didn't really see any rules about what people wear, but I think there are definite expectations. So the expectation is to be able to put your most glamorous, best foot forward. And so how do you do that? You do it sartorially. So what do I mean by sartorial? It's the outfit that you put together. So if you look at the first 1908 Manila Carnival Queen contest, and referring back to some of the things that I said earlier in terms of the press, they go into great detail about what the Queen of the Orient wears. And they talk about it as being the first peplum terno. And so what is a peplum? Peplum is a little skirt at the waist. So it's like a tiny skirt that goes over your skirt. And
like
so they're talking about...
Yeah.
And so they're talking about her being very fashion forward. And then they talk about it as being made of a combination of fabrics, including piña. And we know that piña is like one of the most luxurious and hard to make textiles. It's really expensive and continues to be. Yeah, for good reason, right? It's hard to make. And then they talk about how it's a combination of silk and piña, and then her train has in the embroidery little seed pearls, which were quite expensive at the time, seed pearls and diamonds. And then in a later Manila Carnival Queen, I found a postcard in Chicago of a Manila Carnival Queen. I'm forgetting which one. I'm forgetting the name. But I looked at the back of the postcard, and the person who wrote on the back was describing all of the jewelry that this Manila Carnival Queen was wearing, and it was like ropes of diamonds. And then they also talked about all of the diamonds in, that was laced into her hair. So
Wow.
It's just about exhibiting so much wealth and luxury. And over time, because they're very fashionable, like you're supposed to be fashionable, right? The styles shift, and it shows how like the terno changes, and it'll, shift with like the fashion of the terno. But what remains the same is the sort of luxurious, fabrics and textiles, and it's all high fashion. So one can imagine how expensive it is, and then it gets more expensive as couturiers become more prominent.
Yes,
yeah.
It's I can't help but think that this is really just reproducing the same structures of of privilege and prestige. So continuing this, we have another question in the Q&A box from Vicente, who asks, aside from the nationalist press, were there any progressive Americans at the time who criticized the evident racist bias in these contests? The answer is no.
No, not that I saw. I'm sure maybe, maybe there were really critical people.
Documented.
I wanna hope, but I didn't really see evidence of that in my research. Sorry.
It's okay if the answer is short and sweet. So we have another question comparing the pageants from before to more contemporary pageants. If I can find it, I found it. The question is, do Manila Carnival candidates and queens, are they required to have advocacies similar to the Miss Universe pageants today? Like, were there platforms? Like people run, quote unquote, on a platform?
So slightly different. So I mentioned earlier that universities and clubs can so what they do is they nominate someone so like the Smiles Club of University Philippines nominates. So there was something called a Smiles Club. They choose their person that represents them. So it's not in terms of advocacy, but it's about who you represent, which is, these different organizations. And so it's slightly different. I think advocacy in terms of beauty pageantry that we are more familiar with, that's fairly new. I mean, it's becomes part of the marketing of these, like the big four competitions. Yeah. So, and then that, so I'm actually doing more research on Miss Universe. That's like my current research, is to look at Miss Universe as a way to understand the Cold War. And so I'm looking at a lot of other things, but this is just one sort of part of it. And so I'm trying to understand exactly what you're asking. Is like, when do these things happen? Like, why do they shift? Like why does advocacy become part of the beauty pageant? And I think it's because it's supposed to be about total women, and it's like brains and beauty kind of thing. And it's interesting because now Miss Universe is really changing. Not really, they're really trying to rebrand with like the new owner of Miss Universe. She's so fascinating. And you could see that they're really trying to say that this is for and by women. And she's so fascinating. She's a Thai billionaire trans woman who bought the Miss Universe franchise, or whatever you want to call it, Miss Universe. She bought Miss Universe. And if you're curious, look at her speech from this past Miss Universe, and you could see just what her mission is and how she's trying to rebrand it, and how they're trying to interweave advocacy more firmly into the pageants.
That's actually my follow-up question was actually related to the start of your answer, which was these women who were representing organizations. Was it implicit that the organizations themselves had some kind of advocacy or message? Like the Smiles group that you mentioned, was that just like a random name? Or
I don't know. I mean, like, so I couldn't find that more information about like what is this organization, but a lot of them are like fraternities. So because they're, again, this also reflects on what's happening in the Philippines and historical change in the Philippines. So UST has been there forever, right? It's like, everybody likes to say it's like older than Harvard. So but if you look at this time period, you also see the emergence of many more universities, and so with that comes college life, and with college life are these different groups and organizations. I wasn't so familiar with what they represented, and they seem more like social clubs.
To this day, quite.
Yeah. I mean, there are women's groups, right? So there were a lot of women's groups that were doing, working on like various things for advocacy of what was considered the purview of women. But what's interesting is that none of these women's groups actually had like a contestant. It's all of these university clubs. Yeah.
It feels like it's something that would be almost an unspoken, that it sounds like it would even be taboo for them to join. But we're straying a bit from the topic. We have another question from the Zoom box that says, thank you for this riveting discussion. Did the Queen of the Occident wear Western style or Philippine style garments? And what would be the implications in terms of identity politics and cultural appropriation? Were there instances of this? Because your descriptions were that
she definitely wore a Western style costume. So she wore a silk dress that had a satin finish. It's really detailed, sorry. But it had satin finish. And then she had a cape, and it had this sort of where it rises in the back. So it looks like what a sort of interpretation of what a monarch should look like in a Western sense. And so I think your library has these images of her, of Marjorie Colton. And so there isn't she very firmly wears something that is like quote unquote Occidental, which I think is really strange to kind of demarcate that, because the history of the terno is called a traje de mestiza, right? Which is it's mestiza. So it's like it's a mix, right? And so I mean, I'm getting into a tangent, but so I will not do that. But no, Marjorie Colton very firmly wore sort of imagined Western wear of what a monarch should look like.
Just to continue that, what's fascinating to me is like when you look at images of monarchs, like European monarchs, especially the British, they are extremely ornate and extravagant in the way they like, even the cows that we were describing. But by contrast, the Queen of the Occidents really did look quite plain compared to Filipino counterparts.
Yes.
So it's a bit.
Yeah. So in my book, sorry, just to pub my book a little bit, but in an earlier my first chapter, I had mentioned this a little bit in my talk. When American women there's a group of American women who go to the Philippines around 1900, and they're accompanying the Second Philippine Commission. They're like the wives, sisters, whatever, of the Philippine Commission, which is made up mostly of American men, including Taft, right, who later becomes Governor General and later on becomes President of the United States. So anyways, these white American women go to the Philippines, and I found, not specifically from these women, but letters that white women would write to Vogue magazine about asking what to wear in the Philippines to go to the Philippines. So, so the Vogue magazine says like, oh, just wear, it's really hot, so just wear linen and cotton, and and they're talking about the climate and stuff. And so if you look at the photographs of these women, they're wearing what is the colonial uniform. So French women wear this when they go to Indochine, what was then called Indochine, where British women wear this in India, whatever. And so they're wearing these clothes. And then I found these letters in an archive in Michigan of one of the white women. And she is so upset that she's not dressed well. And she's like, I have these regrets. Like, these women are dressed so well because they go to the Western Visayas and they are sort of feted by elite sugar money families, right? Sort of who are really wealthy. Like, they are so wealthy that half the time they live in Paris. So, and so I have these like really detailed letters of like, they were making fun of me because I only had one crown. And then one woman asked me where my diamonds were. And she was like, they dress really well. And so I talk about this a lot. I have a whole chapter dedicated to this, but I talk about this as a way to understand like politics, to say like, you can read into pettiness to actually see like what is the sort of political impetus behind these sort of comments, and like, why would someone feel so much envy and shame? It's actually because she was so faithful to this idea of her American supremacy that it was really hard for her to accept that her fantasies of what she was going to encounter in the Philippines was completely blown away. And then looking at her comments, you could see like what actually was the sort of investment for these Visayan women in particular to, showcase a lot of their wealth. It's about power. Right. So anyways,
I love that story.
On a tangent.
I love that story. I was like, it's inappropriate for me to laugh, but I'm laughing.
No, I'm just like cackling, when I'm reading this in the archives. Like, can you imagine? Like, I'm in a librarian at the University of Michigan at the Bentley Historical, collection, just like laughing. I remember getting shushed because I was like laughing so hard. But yeah, it's like both. It's entertaining.
It is. It's entertaining and also incredibly complex because you are, what you described in your talk was largely from the Pinoy perspective about how we were able to retaliate. But now you've shown, well, what is the impact on the other side, right? They also felt it. Genevieve, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to shift gears here because some World War II questions have popped in, and this lecture is celebrating the Roderick Hall Memorial Collection. So we have one question that asks, did the carnivals fully stop during the Japanese occupation, or were there other mishmash iterations of it during and after the war? And if I could add, what I was thinking too in relation to that question is, how did the beauty industrial complex that you've been discussing aspects of it, how did that carry over into the Japanese occupation?
Oh, these are great questions. Yeah, really good. So my book ends with the horizon, with the war on the horizon. And the way that there's this anticipation of war is very clear. And so in terms of these kind of large scale things, they do stop in a way. but other sort of venues of appearance and beauty take place. So there are a lot of films. So a lot of actresses become quite famous during the World War II period because the film industry becomes a really important imperial cultural formation under Japanese empire. So like Tres Marias is created under during the Japanese military takeover. So you don't have beauty pageants in this large scale way, but you do have other sort of forms of celebrity. And you can see that being sort of pushed forth in a lot of Japanese newspapers and magazines, which are really interesting because they're written in both Tagalog and then English, and then sometimes Japanese, so they're like sort of trilingual, and you can see that. And the purpose of that, so I have an essay actually about this, not just about films, but the purpose of these sort of cultural things that are very gendered is to present a sense of normalcy under war. So even though you're under conditions of warfare, and when I say conditions of warfare, it is both in terms of like military violence, but also, the kind of military governance, right? Like that, and also famine, like there's no trade, right? So nothing's coming in. Poverty, famine, like this idea of scarcity, also surveillance, there's a curfew, like Japanese soldiers, you have like a check-in. So it's active warfare, but it's also all of these other warfare conditions, right? So there's this idea that you want to kind of project this idea of normalcy to show that everything is okay, that actually you want the people in charge to be in charge. And so the representations of Filipino women become really important in kind of projecting this idea of normalcy under conditions of war. So it kind of answers your question. It kind of does it. And then after World War II, it takes a few years and then kind of comes up. Beauty pageants come up again. And that's something that I'm interested in, is like when that happens and how.
Oh, is that part of your research? Because that is actually like the Second World War II related question, which is a follow-up. It says, from what you know, how soon after the Second World War were national beauty contests reinstated?
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's something that I want to find out. I know fashion gets reinstated pretty quickly. So like by 1950, you have
high fashion.
High fashion. So a lot of the people who are known in post World War II, they were actually quite important pre World War II. So they were coming up in the 1930s. So like Ramon Valera, who becomes really important. He was actually already important. So like he was already making gowns in the 1930s, and then there's a break, and then post World War II, you see this resurgence of Filipina high fashion, and then it becomes something else. So I know it more in terms of fashion, but I don't know yet in terms of beauty pageants. You'll have to wait for my second book. Sorry.
We're waiting. We're eagerly anticipating it. But returning to your original answer about how the Japanese wanted to reinforce that everything was normal, that everything was good. It actually reminded me so much of your talk when you said that the Manila Carnival was actually done, or one of the reasons was to hide or put in the background the fact that the Filipino-American War was ongoing. But under the Japanese occupation, how were these representations manifested? In other words, because these pageants are all about excess, about prestige, and you can't really show that in a time of scarcity and,
Yeah, so it's not about excess. Yeah, it's more about a middle class existence that didn't exist at that time. And so it's not about glamour and ostentation that way. It's much more about the middle class. So actually a lot of articles are about grocery shopping, for example, and they'll show a lot of pictures of women going grocery shopping, and that's a very middle class thing, right? Because it's also, you're grocery shopping in a store, you're not going to like the outdoor market, okay? So it's very classed in that way, but not upper class, right? So if you were upper class, you wouldn't be doing grocery shopping. So it's a very middle class thing, but it's the importance in the documents in these Japanese magazines is to say that there is food. And because there was a lot of food scarcity, but they wanted to say like, no, look at these happy women are buying food. And then they would also show women like doing things that were seen as womanly tasks, so like sewing, and like they would give like tips on like how to like hem something or like print a pattern. And so these kinds of displays of feminine work and domain become really important in trying to paint a picture of what life under Japanese rule would be. And this is sort of, as you point out, Charlene, like a continuation of my argument, which is to say, like, these things that we think of as so normal and boring, maybe, or not boring, but frivolous and mundane or everyday, often seem very separate from politics or things that are considered like up here kind of history. And in fact no, like they're so intertwined, and it's like the cultural that is so intrinsic to political projects. And that in fact is also how a lot of how everyday people process what is happening, right, is through culture. And you can find, and that's where you find evidence of people who are often left out of historical narratives too.
I love that we've moved into material culture, because that's where we are. And even your example of how women were given little tips here, this is how you hem, this is how you sew. What's behind that is the fact that it's scarcity. You have to mend and sew your own clothes because you can't
you can't buy any. Right, you can't buy any. And then in my essay I talk about how like the sort of ingenuity of Filipino women from all various classes, what they do to sort of to survive starvation. It's not about just going to the store. It's about using techniques that are either like native to their region, or things that they learned during the Spanish Empire or even prior to that. And so it's as a sort of countervalence to the kinds of propaganda, the wartime propaganda that's happening.
Yeah, again, that's a wonderful answer, because you're focusing on the indigenous, the native aspect, and how this is actually a form of resistance. It's what's going to save you in that context.
How do you survive, right?
So those were my two World War II questions, but now we're moving to prior to World War II. Renz is asking, were there any beauty contests prior to the Manila Carnival Queen or the American occupation? I think the idea is that the Manila Carnival Queen is a formalized foreign contest, right? But were there contests that were maybe our contests and other ones? Did a foreign import that just came here?
Yeah, so I got through this more in the book, and I think it's a mistake to say that beauty pageants are an import, right? And I think that that's often how they're talked about, is like that beauty pageants were brought within, and then that's why we have this pageantry industry, when in fact pageantry has long been a part of Filipino culture, and also of many different specific ethnic cultures within the archipelago. And so, I borrowed the work of Doreen Fernandez in the book to talk about this idea of festivity and fiestas, and that those long histories of cultivation of having fiestas is actually at the heart of the ostentation. And when I say ostentation, I don't mean it in a negative way. And Doreen Fernandez talks about this too in her work, where she's like, oftentimes when people say ostentation, like it comes with a sort of pejorative meaning, but ostentation doesn't have that, right, in these contexts. And that so I think those things that were also tied to like religious feasts, right, were long being practiced. And not only were they practiced way before US occupation, those feasts were also sites of resisting sort of colonial influence. So when you have these sort of religious patron like fest, we all have, like, every town has a fiesta, right? And like, and then somebody is crowned like queen for that fiesta, so like, like the Santa Cruzan is, you know what I mean? Like all of these things, right? Or and then like Flores de Mayo and stuff, like these things come from the Spanish period, but they were originally there to sort of subjugate Filipinos. And I use Filipinos loosely, understanding that there are many different ethnic groups, okay? And but they were used to try to like subjugate. But what you end up seeing is that, people cannot be contained, right? So they kind of you see communities take on these sort of religious fiestas and make it into something else, and it becomes vernacularized, as anthropologists say, or indigenized, as others might say, to be something else that is actually so powerful. And it's like those kinds of traditions that I tried to trace to the Manila Carnival Queen contest, which was also trying to be contained, right? It was like really choreographed, really trying to be controlled, and yet it could not be controlled. And then it turned into something else. So I say this because I mean, I hear it a lot in terms of like what is influence and like what, gets put into the Philippines. But I think that beauty contests become something in and of its own. And it's really, I'm trained in both Philippine history, but also US history. So if you look at the history of US beauty pageants, they look really different from beauty pageants in the Philippines. And, like if you trace them like side by side, like, what's happening in like 1920s over here, what's happening in 1920s over here, like they're different.
Yeah.
And so that already kind of undermines the sort of idea of like just sort of like transplanting something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was pointed out actually in the chat by Virgilio that the Flores de Mayo and the Santa Cruzan, like these the religious festivals from Spanish times that you mentioned, could be perceived as the beauty pageants of their day, like,
Oh yeah,
right?
totally. Because it's also like who gets to be chosen to be the
Exactly.
queens of those days.
And they embody, right? They embody
Mhm.
the values of that particular.
Oh yeah, absolutely, right?
Thing.
They embody like what is supposed to be you know,
Pure.
feminine and a proper girl, a proper woman, right? I mean, Mina Rosas, who's a historian I really admire so much, she talks about, maganda. And she says like, when you say maganda, it's not just external beauty. It's also, your comportment, like, are you good inside? Like your character, your qualities. And I think, to that comment in the chat, like that's, and Charlene, to just kind of build on what you're saying, like you can see this and who gets chosen for these festivities, right? And if you're not familiar with what beauty means, it's not just external, but like who's your family, like who's your character, then you kind of don't understand the particularities and the complexities behind it. And I think that's what I'm trying to show, and those sort of threads, and make them sort of part of the main story.
So like how you actually brought up the carnivalesque again, but I'll try to get back to it. But I like how we're talking about external beauty as a reflection of like maybe character, what's inside.
Yeah.
There is a question in the chat, in the Zoom box, that says, would you say that the idea of feminism was represented during pageantry's early days? I think they mean our more modern concept of feminism, meaning were participants valued for their substance and not just for their looks and their reputation? So was that already present?
Yeah. So I think, it's that's a really great question. I really love that question. So you can sort of think about it in multiple ways. Like it's if we have a feminist lens, right, in the moderns, or let me backtrack. If we look at it through a feminist lens, I think there's a lot of critiques to be made about beauty pageant, and I totally agree with those critiques. And at this end, so that's not wrong, that's correct, right? And at the same time, if you look at the history of feminism in the Philippines, that, Pura Villanueva Calao was a feminist. She was a part and a leader and like one of the sort of leaders of in the first feminist group. And now I'm like totally blanking on the name, but one of the very first feminist groups, it was in Spanish, in the Philippines, right? She started it in Iloilo, and then, and then she was a part of that. So I don't think that they saw them as like diametrically opposed to one another, because actually, in fact, a lot of when I said that people were obsessed with like the character of beauty queens, they would also talk about, their degrees. Like, oh, what are they studying in college? Oh, she's studying, X, Y, and Z. Like, she also has honors and, in her classes, and she's also a part of these kinds of women's groups and things like that. And so I think that is because of how beauty is envisioned, is that it is so much about, yes, appearance, but it is also about like, who are you? And so they were not diametrically opposed. And a lot of the women were part of feminist organizations. And then also sometimes they would critique it too. They'd be like, oh, you just talk about me being a beauty queen, and then like, but I also did all of these other things. And that is also part of the story. Yeah.
I mean, the reality is that beauty is a double-edged sword. I've always seen it as something that can be incredibly subversive, incredibly powerful, and you can utilize it that way, then why not? Continuing this feminist thread, we have...
Yes, thank you. Someone said it in the chat. Sorry. Asociación Feminista Ilonggo. Thank you. Yeah.
So the other feminist question is, some feminist groups think beauty contestants are a degradation of women, a commodification, reducing women to a showpiece. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's also true. I think that, of course, it depends on the context. And I think that beauty pageants can be about objectification and commodification. I think that's absolutely true. And I do think that I had already said this before, where they are powerful because they do define what is normal, and what are the sort of boundaries and bounds of what is considered ideal or desirable as a feminine person. And at the same time, you have these other beauty pageants that can be quite subversive. And that, Charlene, as you said, like sometimes it's with intention to be put on display, to make a point, or to put forth maybe something that is subversive, that goes against these sort of norms. So I think that those things are true, those critiques. I think we should pay attention to the critiques. I think that when it gets dangerous is when you just kind of say like, well, I think the danger is in generalizations. So when you say, well, all beauty pageants are objectification and therefore we shouldn't pay attention to them, then I think we kind of do a disservice to looking at how culture works. So I think it's important to say, like, well, here's this thing that is very powerful. So what can that tell us about society, right? As opposed to just dismissing it. And I think that's sometimes where I'm like, well, I agree with your critiques, but I don't think that means we should just ignore it. I think that means we should double down and engage, and then see what does that tell us, and then what can change, and then maybe what are the possible, sort of possible other routes that pageantry can take or show us about subversion or resistance. Resistance is not, I don't think it's something that we should romanticize. Sometimes resistance movements have a lot of problems within it too, and also does important work. And so that's sort of my take, right? Is to be able to critique and appreciate.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. We have a follow-up question from Jenna. I believe she asked a question earlier, but the second question is regarding the Manila Carnival Queens. What were the initial reactions of Filipinos towards pageantry?
Yeah, so it was kind of mixed at first, I think. So with the first Manila Carnival, the first winner was actually a Chinese mestiza woman from, I'm gonna pronounce this wrong, so I'm sorry, but from the Limhop family, Limjap. They were really a wealthy, super wealthy Chinese family, in particular the Manila area. And so one of the daughters wins, and she pulls out of the competition. This is before Pura wins, and she pulled out of the competition, and it says that she's going on a tour in Japan. But I think that is also because there's sort of people are a little bit unsure at first, like how to like take this, because although there are roots in what I was saying in terms of fiestas and stuff, there is a shift with the Manila Carnival in that it's secularized, so there is no religious component to it, and it makes people nervous. And in fact, there are some political cartoons. If you look at this book on Filipino political cartoons of the time period, that's also at FHL, by Alfredo Rosas. There's a political cartoon that's like about the Manila Carnival Queen contest, and it's kind of talking about like, what is the morality of what's going to happen to the morality of the girls that do this. So that's sort of like the initial feeling, and then I think it just grows in popularity. So there are always critiques, for sure. And there are responses to those critiques. So you'll see that the contest winners always have chaperones. They are never by themselves. Their chaperones are always mentioned in the articles that talk about them, right? And to kind of give a sense of propriety, and maintain, a particular image of womanhood. So I wouldn't say that those critiques go away, but that you can see that those critiques are there because there's a response to it, right?
No, that's fascinating. I actually had not considered the secular aspect. Once you mentioned it, yes, that's so obvious now. Another question from the chat, the Zoom box says, you mentioned earlier that participants who were not even natives of a certain place were selected. Do you think this was because those selected somehow met Western standards of beauty more? It's an interesting angle from the cultural appropriation we discussed.
Yeah. I mean, Pura is she's from Iloilo, and she's another, and then she gets to be Manila Carnival Queen. I don't know if it has to do with Western beauty standards in that sense. She does, well, yes. So she does fulfill Western beauty standards. She's half Spanish, right? So her mother's last name is Garcia. She is Spanish, who marries into the Villanueva family. She is not wealthy. She herself, she's not a wealthy person, but she's Spanish. So that's where sort of like the features come from. So I think, yes, but it's also like, it's not, and I talk about this in the book, where it's like, when we say mestiza, it is about Western, but it's not American Western
Right.
yet. Right. And actually, that a lot of mestizas at the time really saw themselves as racially superior to Americans because they trace their Westernness through Europe. And Europe is the center of culture and not the United States. So I think that that's something really important to like think about in terms of like when we say like Western features. The other thing that get in terms of like how people get chosen is like, one can make the argument that it is Western influence in terms of like you get selected because of you, again, like this checklist of things like where do you go to school, like do you go to college, what college do you go to, who is your family. And so you could make I guess one can make the argument like, the reason why there are proliferation of schools is because the institutionalization of a new education system in the United States. So that's one, I mean, from the United States. So that's one way. But again, that would like discount already formed hierarchies that developed prior to the United States. So I'm not saying that so I'm saying that you look at colonialism, but you look at colonialism's influence across the board. That sometimes I think Westernization, I think when we say Westernization, we actually mean colonialism. and so my point is like, actually, let's just look at
What it is.
colonialism instead, because then you can get at the sort of nitty gritty.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We have another question from Carl, who writes, "Good day, ma'am Genevieve. May I ask if these carnival queens and Miss Philippines have mingled with each other during the pre-war period? Are there any interesting stories in their personal lives, interactions with each other, and movements they initiated during the challenging times of war-torn Philippines?
Yeah.
Thank you, and may God bless you and your work."
Oh, thank you. That's so nice. So I tried to look for gossip and to see like if there were any stories about that. And I couldn't really find any that were printed, but I did know that they socialized with one another quite a bit. So there are different social events that are yearly, and like, for example, like there are different balls that are held, and like Mancomunidad, and there's like
Oh, the
another one.
Mancomunidad ball, of course. That is
Yeah,
a presidential ball. Very, very.
yeah. So they go to those, and then there's like another one that's just for Visayan women, or the Visayan community. It's held in Manila, but it's for elite Visayans. And I was sorry, it's like almost midnight here, so I'm like forgetting
on it.
Yeah, it's so they socialize in those ways. And then they're also invited to fashion shows. So in the book I talk about how like these are kind of the first models, so they get invited to showcase like fashion reviews and stuff, so they interact. A lot of them are also classmates, and a lot of them are also related to one another. Yes, that one. Yeah, but it's held in Manila, but it's not for the Manila community. And sorry, I was responding to someone in the chat. And then So it's a smallish world. And part of the argument that I'm trying to make too is that with the Manila Carnival Queens is also when Manila actually becomes a capital. So Manila is already a capital, but it like socially becomes a capital. So now you have a social season, whereas you didn't really have that much before. And now you have this new culture that where they're gonna sort of
Yeah.
rub shoulders with one another. And that's happening, with the Manila Carnival Queen contest, but also because you have more universities happening in Manila. So people from the, you go from the province, so that, then you like go to school in Manila, and then you have more social things happening in Manila. So there is a new social season and a new social world that they definitely interacted with one another. I couldn't get the gossip. I wish I desperately wanted it. I wanted to know if there were like fights. And, but I didn't find any of that. I'm sure there were, but I didn't get to see
It would
any of
be
it.
so hard to find documentation of
Yeah,
something
yeah.
like that.
That's
Like,
like where,
what would the sources be?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
But yes, that's a fascinating argument. The idea of a social season helping Manila become
Mhm.
a true capital in that sense, because I think most people feel that I mean today we're very, very Manila centric, which is why um, we are one of our goals here at FHL is to do more regional programming because
Yeah.
we're so aware of how Manila centric um,
Yeah, yeah. And that
our
really develops during this time.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move into your book because there are actually questions about your research.
Sure.
So Jenna, I think this is Jenna's third question. Thank you for participating
Yeah,
so
thanks,
much.
Jenna.
She says, what were the challenges you encountered in starting and finishing your book, Beauty Pageants? I love your book. I just got a copy.
Oh, that's so great. Thanks. Okay, challenges. Um, I think writing a book is really hard generally. So many editing processes, and sometimes I just wanted to give up because I'm so tired. But in terms, I think what you're asking too is about research challenges. It's really hard. So in the book, I talk about the like how I was told I wasn't going to find anything, and then in fact, like I did find a lot. But even when I found a lot, sometimes I didn't find what I was looking for. So there, so I think the presence of Filipinas in the archives are huge, but oftentimes women are not named. So
Mhm.
remember when I was telling you the story about the American woman who was complaining and like really upset
Right.
that she was, being made fun of? She never names any of the Filipino women. So I had to guess who these women were, or I had to like gesture and like, she doesn't say who they are, but they could be someone like this, and I think that that's just what some of the challenges of historical research is like, we're tied to these documents and like archives, and sometimes those documents don't totally exist, and or like people are not named or things are left out. And then the challenge then is like, well, do we just say that people are not important, or and they're not worthy to be written about? So I had to like come up with other ways to try to like piece together this history. Yeah, and I just did it by like putting things like fragments together, or like things that you wouldn't think go together. Like I have like documents from the Secretary of War in the US government writing about fashion. And I was just like, you know what? I'm gonna look in the unlikely place, and I bet you I'm gonna find something. And then just piece it together, and then look for connections that you wouldn't think would be there. And I think that's very difficult. But is
It's
you
the
know?
joy of research. You're
Yeah.
describing the joy of research. Just to follow up this research question, my interest is in how you choose what aspects of material culture to follow, because material culture is a great way to trace certain threads in history. But how do you, from all the components of the industrial
Mhm.
beauty complex, how do you know? Or is it just like elimination? Let's just try this.
Um, I I'm sort of a I'm not an efficient researcher. I is what I've been told is like I just look at everything and then like I just slog in the archive and I look at, if there's like one newspaper, I'll look at every single issue and every single page. And sometimes out of like 1,000 pages, I'll find one thing. And that's for me, and I think what it is just looking for patterns and then I kind of just get a sense of like, oh, okay, that's connected to this or like, and so looking for patterns, or the other thing is looking, I just kind of have I think I've like developed an instinct for like, oh, that's so weird. Like, what is that all about? And so when I ever get that feeling of like that's really weird, then I'll sort of chase that and I'll try to find, I'll try to like dig deeper. And so it's very inefficient. I don't think other researchers do that. But
And I disagree. You may call it inefficient, but honestly, to me, it just sounds like you're very creative. That research for you is think out of the box. These are not
yeah, yeah.
traditional research methods, and where
Yeah,
will that kind of creativity take you? And
yeah.
it's served
It's
you
also
well.
Yeah, I think so, and I also think, I have to give credit to a lot of people who have come before me, like, a lot of work that I've read, especially, like, feminist scholars who's, like, they write about being suspicious, and so I think I was already, like, kind of brought that in, like, a level of suspicion in the documents I was reading, so if something seemed off, I was like, "Oh, that's weird. I'll follow that." And so that's something like really developed by like post-colonial feminists, like third world feminists, transnational feminists, women of color feminists. Um, and so, I have to really give credit to a lot of the people who did that work before me. Yeah.
Genevieve, I hate to say it because time has absolutely flown, but there's actually only 8 minutes left
Oh, okay.
in this webinar. This is undoubtedly the longest Q&A session that we've ever been able to have.
Oh,
I really
wow. Okay.
hope that you're able to look at the chat box, because the discussion here is really, really rich from our participants.
Oh,
Um,
that's so
we'll
great.
try to give you a copy of this
Yeah, I
list.
would love that. Yeah.
Yes, but thank you so much for um, such an insightful, very, very rich Q&A session. Um, before before we go though, can I ask you to discuss about the availability of your book? Because so many people, even in pre-reg, have already been asking about it. How can
Sure.
we get this book?
Yeah, so it's from Duke University Press, but you can order it through Amazon. I think it might take a while for it to arrive, because it is published in the United States, but you can definitely order. They do have international distribution, and then, hopefully in the future, I hope to try to work something out to have a local um, uh,
Publisher.
publisher. Yeah, yeah. So, hopefully.
Yes,
Hopefully
yes,
soon.
we're hoping for that too, because then the
Yeah.
book will be more affordable.
Yeah, yeah. In the meantime, Amazon is probably your best bet. Yeah.
And for our viewers, Genevieve has very graciously donated a copy of her book to the library.
Yeah.
So when it gets here, you can also come to
Yeah.
FL to read the book. So
It's on its way.
it's,
Again,
we
it's
know,
gonna take a
we
while.
know. So when it gets here, we'll post about it on social media and hopefully we'll get a good response. Genevieve, thank you so much. This was incredibly enjoyable, and I hope that there will be a part 2 before your second book gets published. But Any final words for our audience?
Oh, I just want to thank everyone for coming here. It's been so wonderful to engage with all of you. And I really want to thank, Charlene and the FHL staff. There's so much work that goes behind this production. And I am just so happy to be a part of this, and thank you for the invitation.
We're so happy that you accepted, Genevieve, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
So the Roderick Hall Memorial Lectures is a series of 3 talks that we hope will become an annual event of the library's programming. If you missed the inaugural lecture, Planes, Trains, and Battels, Transportation in World War II Philippines, with Dr. Ricardo Jose last March 18, you may now watch it on FHL's YouTube channel, youtube.com/Filipinas Library. We hope that you'll be able to join Thomas McKenna as he concludes the lecture series on April 15 with Unsung Heroes of Mindanao, the Moro resistance fighters of World War II. And if you enjoyed today's free lecture, please follow FHL's social media pages for updates, as well as the Ayala Foundation and the Ayala Museum. You can find us all on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. The Ayala Museum and Filipinas Heritage Library are open to visitors and researchers. To book a visit or to learn about upcoming programs, go to ayalamuseum.org and filipinaslibrary.org.ph. Again, thank you everyone for joining us to commemorate Roderick Hall and to preserve the legacy that he entrusted with FHL. Please stay safe and stay healthy. See you in 2 weeks at our next webinar.
Rod described himself as a man with a mission and a man in a hurry. His mission was to collect as many materials on the experiences of Filipinos during World War II and to place them in a library that would ensure that these are shared with today's generation as well as those in the future. And he found this repository as well as partners with us in the Filipinas Heritage Library. So in 2010, Rod shipped his entire collection, lock, stock, and barrel, of 700 volumes from his home in London to FHL in Makati. Through the years, his collection has grown to more than 2,000 print and non-print materials on World War II, making the Roderick Hall collection FHL's crown jewel. As such, it is FHL's centerpiece, literally and figuratively, because we now revolve our collection focus around the period immediately before, during, and right after World War II, identified as the formative period of Philippine nationhood.
To collect books and various other historical materials relating to the Philippines during that war and to make this more accessible to the general public. He turned this collection over to the Filipinas Heritage Library, where it now forms a major part of its holdings as the Roderick Hall Collection. But Rod was not one to simply donate books. He wanted other people to use them and to research more on the war. He wanted to add more materials and was constantly in search of new directions for the collection. To this end, he was able to negotiate digitization of numerous manuscripts in various collections around the Philippines. He wanted to provide as many different perspectives as possible, and when he learned of the large body of works in Japanese, aimed to acquire as much as possible for the collection.
Why are you collecting Japanese publications about the Battle of Philippines, even though you do not understand Japanese language? You said to me. I always answer this question like that. I want next future generation to know what happened in Philippines during the Asia Pacific War and the Philippines under Japanese rule. However, you told me the real reason is that collecting Japanese books is to make peace of my mind and making requiem for my deceased family. As a post-war Japanese generation, I promise you to try to make no more war society and also to try not to create the kind of people such as you and your family horribly experienced in Philippines. I think the Japanese should know the facts of this history. I believe this is my mission as a Japanese.
Current thinking on the previous century, with its many upheavals and wars, is that we all have an ethical obligation to remember that history. But understandably, not everyone takes up that burden because the memory of war, especially for persons who witnessed it, is painful. The late Mr. Rod Hall was deeply courageous in that sense of taking up an ethical burden. He took pains to give World War II its proper mourning, not just for himself, but also for our country, America and Japan, whose materials he collected. He helped strengthen our cultural memory in the hope of preventing the return of suffering. And now with his passing, we in turn at Filipina's Heritage Library and Ayala Foundation have an obligation to make his legacy and his commemoration of history endure.